morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andy Benson, and I'm the Director of the CNS Autoimmune Inflammation Therapeutic Areas for Sightline. And today my presentation is entitled Dissecting Trials with Positive Outcomes to Identify Strategies for Success. So firstly, just to run through the agenda of what I'm going to talk about today, we're going to spend some time looking at the data set that was used in this analysis, and we're going to look at some broad trends that can be taken from looking across that data set. And then I'm going to drill down into a specific case study in the central nervous system therapeutic area. So there's been many studies done in the past that have focused on looking at the overall likelihood of success of a molecule reaching the marketplace, and also the likelihood of success for a drug to transition through the different phases of development, for example, moving from phase 1 to phase 2. Joe DeMassi's group at the Tufts Center for Study for Drug Development published a paper in 2013 that found that there was a between 14 and 18.5% overall success rate for molecules from the top 50 pharmaceutical firms. The same group published a paper back in 2010 that found there was a 19% overall success rate for drugs to move from phase 1 through to approval. And interestingly, there were some differences between small and large molecules, with a 13% success rate for small molecules and a 32% success rate for larger molecules. And Biomed Tracker's Michael Hay presented at Bio 2011 and found that there was a 9% overall success rate. And interestingly, he found that there was a 14.5% success rate for lead indications, but only a 3% success rate for follow-on indications. But really, up until now, trial-level success rates have not been reported, and this has been because there's not really been an aggregated data set that was large enough to perform any meaningful analysis. So the data set that was used for this analysis today came from Sightline's database of clinical trials called TrialTrove. And Sightline's analysts have diligently gone through all of the trials completed since the beginning of 2008 and tagged them with outcomes where available. So for the purposes of this presentation, how are we defining a positive outcome for a clinical trial? So a positive outcome is if the trial's endpoints, the primary endpoints, were met with statistical significance, and or a sponsor or an investigator associated with that trial had declared that the trial had a positive outcome or was otherwise successful. So in this data set of clinical trials in TrialTrove that completed between the beginning of 2008 and the end of 2012, there were in total just over 7,000 clinical trials. And our analysts identified that 3,686 of those trials had positive outcomes. So this equates to an overall success rate of 52.6%. So much higher than the success rate that we were seeing when looking at molecules reaching the marketplace or transitioning through different phases. And really that's to be expected when you think about looking at individual clinical trials. You would expect to see a higher success rate. But it does mean that still nearly 50% of clinical trials are not being successful, or otherwise the outcome cannot be identified. Now, you can see on this slide now some top headline figures from this data set. So firstly, you can see the top 10 diseases that were on those positive outcome clinical trials. And you can see that type 2 diabetes had the most trials overall. But really, if you look across this data set, you can see that there's diseases from all the therapeutic areas that Sightline is covering. So we can see some oncology indications, we can see things like asthma and hypertension. But I think what is conspicuous by its absence is that there are no diseases from the central nervous system area. And as I said, I'm going to use CNS in a case study shortly. If you look at the top 10 companies, there's no real surprises. It's big pharma, and obviously these are industry-sponsored trials that we're looking at, so you would expect to see the usual players represented here. And indeed, with the top 10 drugs and the top 10 mechanisms of action, again, no real surprises. But I think what is interesting is if you look at the final column, which is the top 10 trial locations, at first glance, this seems to be what you'd expect to see. So we have the US, Western Europe. But if you look down towards the bottom of the list, you can see some more perhaps unusual locations, including Poland and Russia. And interestingly, one of the things we're going to look at as a possible driver of success is an increased geographic spread for clinical trials. So just to orientate you in this slide, because we're going to use this style of chart throughout this presentation. So on the horizontal axis, we have the therapeutic areas in Sightline. So we have oncology, central nervous system, autoimmune inflammation, metabolic, infectious disease, cardiovascular, ophthalmology, and genitourinary. And the lower portion of these bars in the darker color represent the positive outcome clinical trials, and the top part of the bars in the lighter color represent all the other completed trials. So you can see straight away that in oncology we had by far and away the most clinical trials taking place in this data set, followed by CNS and autoimmune. But if we actually now overlay onto the same slide the success rate for those therapeutic areas, you can see actually some interesting variation. And in fact, you can see that oncology's success rate was actually slightly just below the average success rate for this data set, which is represented by the dotted line. And actually, autoimmune inflammation had the highest overall success rate. What's interesting as well is if you look at this data, you can see that the CNS therapeutic area had the lowest overall success rate. And as I said, we're going to use CNS as a case study shortly. So this slide now is looking at the same data set. We're now looking at trial activity by therapeutic area. And this is showing you the top 20 countries that were involved in these positive outcome clinical trials. So the different colors represent different countries. And really, looking across the data set, there's nothing that stands out as being particularly unique to any one therapeutic area. So the top 20 countries were utilized on average by the same degree in the different therapeutic areas. And again, you can really see that these countries are wide geographic spread. You know, we have the US, countries in Western Europe. I think what's conspicuous by its absence from this data set is you can see that there is nothing from China. And obviously we know that China is becoming more and more important in drug development and clinical trial activity. And I think if we looked at the top 20 countries maybe in 10 years' time from positive outcome trials that we're completing, we would see China appearing in this list. Continuing, so with the same data set, obviously now looking at the top 20 countries overall, you can actually see, again, the dotted line being the overall average success rate for this data set, that for the top 20 countries, all of these countries had higher than average overall success rates. And indeed, there's some significant variation here as well. And we're going to talk again about geographic spread as a possible driver of success shortly. This is now looking at the top 20 companies or sponsors of those positive outcome clinical trials. And in this case, you can actually see some variations between the different therapeutic areas. For example, if we look at oncology, which is the first column, you can see that the blue color at the bottom of the bar represents Roche, and you can see Roche ran a lot of oncology trials that had positive outcomes. Similarly, in the autoimmune inflammation area, you can see that GSK has significant involvement. And in the CNS area, the purple area represents Pfizer. So Pfizer ran a lot of positive outcome trials. Again, these are big pharma and these are industry-sponsored trials, so this is probably the pattern you would expect to see. So this slide really is showing you the top therapeutic areas by trial activity. So you can see the success rates here. So autoimmune inflammation, as I mentioned already, had the highest overall success rate of 56%. If you were at Pharmacy USA in 2013, you may have seen my colleague Sylvia Marecki present on the same data set as I'm talking about today. And she actually spent some time talking about a case study in the autoimmune inflammation area. And as I said, this had the highest overall success rate. What I'm going to do today is actually look at the other end of the spectrum, and I'm going to spend some time talking about the central nervous system therapeutic area. As I said, this had the lowest overall success rate, and you could argue that in an area that has such high attrition for clinical trials and drug development, any trials that had a positive outcome could be even more interesting and valuable to analyze. So this is now looking at the top diseases in the CNS therapeutic area specifically, and this is looking again across the data set, and on the horizontal axis now we have the diseases. So you can see that nociceptive and neuropathic pain had the most overall trials, but you can see some variation between the success rates for the different diseases. And the first thing that stands out is that multiple sclerosis had the highest overall success rate. Around 60% of MS trials were successful. Conversely, Alzheimer's disease had the lowest overall success rate, only around 30% of Alzheimer's trials being successful. And this really mirrors what we've seen in the marketplace and in clinical trial development. So there's been a number of MS drugs that have successfully transitioned through the phases over the past few years, and indeed many of these are now rolling out and have reached the marketplace. And in Alzheimer's disease, there's been lots and lots of talk about the late-stage, high-profile failures of Alzheimer's drugs, and this is obviously being mirrored by what we're seeing on this slide here. I wanted to spend a moment and just look if we could see any differences between neurological and psychiatric diseases. And I think there's an impression, whether it's correct or not in the industry, that psychiatry is a particularly difficult area to target. There's a lot of polypharmacology going on with the drugs, and obviously the diseases themselves, by their nature, are very difficult to treat. What we did is we actually tagged the trials in the CNS area as being either neurological or psychiatric. And what you can see on this slide is actually, for this data set, although there was many more neurological trials ran, when you look at the actual success rate, there was no real difference. So certainly, for this data set, you could say that there doesn't seem to be any significant difference in targeting either a neurological or a psychiatric disease. So who were running these trials? So this slide now is looking at the top 20 sponsors for these positive outcome CNS trials. And if you look across the list here again, you can see big pharma, ably represented, with Pfizer running the most positive outcome CNS trials, followed by Johnson & Johnson, GSK, Eli Lilly, and Merck & Company. But I think what's interesting is to pause for a moment and think about what's happening in the industry in the CNS space. Many companies have recently scaled back their CNS drug development. Some players have actually exited CNS completely. And other companies have substantially changed the way in which they do CNS research. So I think if we could actually look into the future and look at a slide of the positive outcome trials maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, we would see a substantially different makeup of companies and sponsors on this slide. And actually, you can get a hint of what that might look like by actually moving to the active data set in TrialTrove and looking at who is currently running CNS trials. So this slide now is showing you the sponsors of the currently active industry-sponsored CNS trials. And immediately you can see that there are some changes here. So Otsuka is now running the most trials, and actually Pfizer's dropped from 1st to 4th. And now we have Lundbeck and UCB also in the top 3. And if you look out across this data set as well, you can actually see that there are some different companies appearing in this list. Indeed, we have some specialist companies such as Ipsen and Teva. And really, I think you would see a very different picture in the future if you could analyze this future data set. So where are these trials, returning to the positive outcome trial data set, the completed trials, where are these trials taking place? And as I mentioned, we were going to look at geographic spread as a possible driver of success. So this slide now is showing you on the horizontal axis the top 20 countries where these positive outcome trials were taking place. Not surprisingly, the United States had the most trial activity overall. But again, if you look across the list, you can see that we really do have a truly wide geographic spread. We have countries from Western Europe. Interestingly, we have India. And really, apart from the Asia Pacific, with the exception of Australia, we do have a really wide geographic spread here. Wanted to point out the very startling high percentage success rate in the Ukraine. You can see that just around 65% of the Ukrainian trials in this data set were successful. So we're going to spend a little time looking at the Ukrainian data set specifically to see what those trials were and what they were being run for. So looking at the Ukrainian trial data set specifically, what diseases were those trials targeting? So this is now showing you CNS Ukrainian positive outcome trials, and along the horizontal axis you had the top 10 diseases. So you can see that multiple sclerosis and schizophrenia had the most overall trials, and again, with the dotted line with the overall success rate now for the CNS trials, you can see that, again, there was some variation in success. Alzheimer's disease having the lowest overall success rate, and anxiety having a very startling 100% success rate, but when you see the number of trials in anxiety, it was obviously a very, very small number. And then you can obviously see as well that we have a number of diseases where the overall success rate was above the average. So this slide is showing you the other locations where the positive outcome CNS trials in the Ukraine had taken place. And as you can see, around 80% of the Ukrainian trials also took place in Russia and the United States. This is not a surprise considering the geographic location of Ukraine and Russia, and obviously the United States being the most common location to be utilized in clinical trials. If you look out across the countries you can see here, you can see that we really do have a wide geographic spread. Countries from, again, Western Europe, we have Canada, we have India. So these do seem to be large, multinational, global clinical trials. In fact, if you look at the trials, 100% of them are multinational, and by multinational I mean they were taking place in at least 2 countries. And only 2 of the trials could be viewed as in one local area, that being Eastern Europe. So the rest have genuinely wide geography. And the bar chart now is showing you the actual number of countries utilized per trial for these positive outcome trials. And you can see that 8 was the highest and most commonly utilized number of trials. But again, you know, there's some variation here, but really you can see that up to a point, having a wide geography seems to correlate with having a successful clinical trial. So I want to spend a little bit of time looking at multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's disease specifically. And if you can remember, these were the 3 diseases that had the highest overall activity in the Ukraine. So one of the first things we can look at is the number of countries utilized per trial. So these 3 graphs now are showing you multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's disease. And on the far left bar, you're seeing the Ukrainian positive outcome trials. So you can see that in the Ukraine, they actually utilized a higher number of average countries per trial than the overall positive outcome trial data set that is the middle bar which again utilized more countries per trial than the far right bar, which is all the other trials that didn't have positive outcomes. And this is the same for multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's disease. And if we look at the number of average reported sites per trial, you see the same pattern. So in the Ukraine, the positive outcome trials were using more sites than the other positive outcome trials and the other outcome trial data set. And we see, again, the same pattern if you look at the average target accrual per trial. So the Ukrainian positive outcome trials were targeting a higher overall accrual rate than the all positive outcome trial data set and the trials that had other outcomes. And I think these three factors all again correspond with these being large global multinational trials. Interestingly, if you look at the average enrollment period in months that was used by these trials, we see a slightly more mixed picture. So in multiple sclerosis, you can actually see that the Ukrainian trials actually had longer average enrollment periods than the other positive outcome trials and the other outcome trials. In schizophrenia, there wasn't really much difference between the Ukrainian and the other positive outcome trials, and the other outcome trials actually had longer enrollment periods. And in Parkinson's disease, the Ukrainian positive outcome trials actually had the shorter average enrollment periods, and there wasn't much difference between the other positive outcome trials and the other outcome trials. So I think you perhaps expect to see the pattern that we see with Parkinson's disease for the other diseases as well, and that's not the case. So I think this really just kind of emphasizes the point that the target enrollment period for a particular disease can vary, and maybe isn't a clear-cut case of a shorter enrollment period is definitely going to get you a positive outcome trial. So what were these MS Ukrainian positive outcome trials? So in this data set, we had 7 phase 2 and we had 12 phase 3 trials, and they were all enrolling relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis patients. There was just one trial enrolling some other subtypes of MS, but even in that trial, the focus was RRMS. So I think relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis is certainly the patient segment to target if you're running an MS trial. 4 were actually for expanded indications. These were for alemtuzumab, onabotulinum toxin A, and glatiramer acetate. And 8 were registrational trials. So we had trials for dimethyl fumarate that was approved as Tecfidera. We have trials for laquinimod, for daclizumab, for cladribine that interestingly actually reached it to the marketplace and then was subsequently withdrawn for commercial reasons. And also for baclofen. In this instance, this was a specific formulation of baclofen from Impax Laboratories that I believe actually, although it successfully completed phase 3 trials, has still not reached the marketplace. And only 6 of these trials utilized biomarkers. Now, there's no FDA-approved biomarker for multiple sclerosis, so perhaps it's not surprising that there's not a massive amount of activity with biomarkers. But again, as we all know, biomarkers are obviously a very, very hot area, and certainly if we, again, looked at analysis maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, we might expect to see a much higher utilization of biomarkers. Even if they weren't an FDA-validated biomarker, I think you would see trials actually attempting to use them. So the final piece of the puzzle really is looking at sites and investigators. And using Sightline's SiteTrove database, you can actually look at very broad pictures of investigators and sites across the globe. So what you can see here is a heat map of investigators in multiple sclerosis. And this is showing you where the investigators were located around the globe for MS trials. So not surprisingly, you can see that there is a cluster of activity in North America and in Western Europe. An interesting thing we can see here actually is some significant activity in India, and we know that with multiple sclerosis, the incidence of the disease actually increases the further away from the equator you go. So it's perhaps a little bit surprising to see so much activity in India. And what you can do is drill down and actually look at the specific organizations that these investigators are associated with. You can look at the sponsors of the trials they've run, and indeed you can look at ongoing and past activity for investigators. So you can really try and target those investigators for your trials that are going to have a higher likelihood of running a successful trial for you. To summarize, what information can we derive from studying positive outcome trials? Well, obviously we can look at who sponsored the trials. We can look at what diseases and patient segments they were for, the drugs they were evaluating, which I guess is key, where they were carried out, and we can also look at individual elements of trial design. So we touched on talking about biomarkers, but there are many other elements of trial design that we could look at if we had more time. Certainly the actual overall design of the trial would be crucial in having a positive outcome trial. And finally, as I just mentioned, we can look at which sites and investigators were utilized by those trials. And obviously, you can use all this information to help you design and plan clinical trials that are going to be much more likely to succeed. So thank you very much for your attention.